Greetings to everyone in Leicester at the Hope and Resilience for Refugees and Migrants conference. I'm so sorry that I can't be there today. I'm Shami Chakrabarti, the Director of Liberty. Unfortunately, there's a really important vote in the House of Lords today on secret courts and shutting out claimants and their lawyers from the courtroom when the government wants to rely on secret evidence. And so it's really important that I'm here in London with my colleagues to see what we can do. It's a real honour to be asked to participate in your conference, even if I have to do it by this virtual means, because it's an incredibly important time for rights and freedoms in the United Kingdom. And as always, it's the most vulnerable in society who have the most to lose. Our human rights framework is under attack. It's under attack all over the world, but it's particularly troubling that it should be so directly attacked so often in Britain, the oldest unbroken democracy on earth, and a country that played such an important part in the struggle for rights and freedoms and in the development of international human rights ideals after World War II. A little context about Liberty. We were formed as the National Council for Civil Liberties in 1934, which may seem like a very different time a long time ago. Of course, it was before reality TV and the discovery of DNA, before the internet and social media. Very different time in so many ways, and yet it was a time of great economic depression and uncertainty. It was between the wars, and the long shadow of war was still cast. It was a time when certain British newspapers that are still in existence today would often run headlines about how Britain was being invaded by refugees from Eastern Europe. And in particular, our organisation was formed because hunger marchers who'd come to London to assemble in Hyde Park, they'd come all the way from the north of the country, peaceful dissenters found themselves brutally met by the Metropolitan Police. Peaceful dissent in the struggle for rights and freedoms shut down by police brutality, and that was the spark that led a small group of people, probably much smaller than the group that you are meeting today, decided to do something about it. They had no blogs and tweets to write, so they wrote a letter to the Manchester Guardian newspaper, as it was then called, and they said, "We are horrified at the brutality that we have seen against these peaceful dissenters, and we today have formed the National Council for Civil Liberties to keep watch over the whole spirit of liberty in our country." And that's the organisation that I represent today. It's a great privilege to represent Liberty's members. I hope some of you are Liberty members or might become Liberty members. I know that so many of you will be friends and supporters. And our struggle and our story, that's now nearly 80 years old, is one of great adversity, great challenge, but also of successes, and also one of hope. And in my experience, sometimes in the darkest moments, in the moments of greatest adversity, the opportunity for the change can also come. But let's talk a little about the challenge. From the start of the international human rights movement, it was founded in memories of the Holocaust. There would be no Universal Declaration on Human Rights if there had not been the horrors and the terrors of World War II. And that is why, let's be clear, the founders of those precious documents, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, and all the other related instruments, knew that this had to be rights for human beings, not rights just for citizens. There had to be some inalienable dignity, equal treatment and fairness that was owed to every single human being just because they were alive. That's every newborn baby and every newly arrived asylum seeker, not because they're good or bad, not because they've yet paid taxes or made some other contribution to society, but just because they're a human being. And that is so important. That's the difference between human rights and citizens' privileges. And this generation, this wartime and post-war generation all over the world had seen graphically and horrifyingly what can happen when you allow human rights to be stripped away at the whim of governments and human rights to be contingent on nationality or other privileged status. And that is why it is no accident at all, it's completely deliberate, that these documents are about human beings and not about nationals of any particular country or any particular region. You could say that the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and all the associated conventions are the world trying to learn a lesson from the Holocaust, but you could also say that the Refugee Convention itself is the world's apology for doing too little, too late to prevent that particular atrocity. I would say that, therefore, this post-war moment has been the most important moment in world history for the development of rights and freedoms, and it's been a very important moment in liberty's journey as well. This idea that we're all entitled to our dignity, to equal treatment and fairness just because we are alive. And this idea also that if human rights are to mean anything, they have to ultimately be protected by an independent judiciary and the rule of law. And that, to be effective, means that people do need access to lawyers and access to the courtroom. They need advice and representation if these rights are to mean anything in practice. Now we fast forward to 2012, this very unsettled, sometimes scary moment as well. The economic crisis, combined with globalisation and so many challenges and fears around the world, make it a very difficult moment for the human rights ideal. Once more we see the rise of xenophobia that comes with people's fears all over Europe and potentially all over the world, fears for their livelihoods and their future and their economic prospects for their families and so on. It seems to me that societies and world movements can go in one or other direction at such a moment. They can cling to the best in human civilization and tradition, to the best values and to the lessons of the past, or they can forget those lessons and repeat mistakes once made and lurch into extremism, xenophobia, racism, clinging to the privileges that particular racial or national groups want for themselves and ignoring the other. But this mistake, that of course has been made all over the world at many times in human history, is particularly disastrous in 2012, in this shrinking, interconnected world in which we all live. National borders are more and more meaningless. People can communicate with each other over the internet. They can be prosecuted around the world and persecuted around the world for things that they did in a completely different jurisdiction as oppressive governments assert jurisdiction over the web. In this shrinking, interconnected world of ours, where we're constantly told that people and nations have to work together to combat climate change and poverty and terrorism and so many of the world's ills, how ironic that the same governments do not want us to come together to share our common humanity and to support international human rights ideals. Now, ironically, all governments will talk about human rights abroad. A human rights instrument can be a very good tool for criticising the failings of foreign powers and other governments. The hardest thing, of course, is to look in the mirror. And I'm afraid that successive British governments have been no different. It still seems to be so much easier to condemn human rights abuses in the Arab world, in the developing world, in the communist world, almost everywhere else, to even at times contemplate invasion and war to protect people who are suffering elsewhere in the world. It seems easier to take those actions than to give succour and refuge when over there comes over here. And the innocent person that you would go to war to protect is no longer over there, but on your doorstep in need of your refuge and support. And that dichotomy, that irony in political behaviour and in some people's attitudes is something that I think as campaigners and activists and advocates of human rights we need to make more of. This is a small world, it's a shrinking world. If we care about human rights over there, we have to lead by example over here, and we have to give refuge to the people that we say we weep hot tears for when we see the images on our TV screens of what has happened to them and how they've been persecuted by their governments elsewhere. And of course, social media and the internet makes instant understanding of people's plight so much easier. We don't just have to wait for even the conventional media and journalists and broadcasters anymore. We can connect with each other all over the world using these tools that can empower all of us. And our values and our messages endure, and they are simple. And it's been my experience that just as it's easy in a time of fear, whether it's fear of depression economically or fear of terrorism or crime, just as it's easy to whip up hysteria and xenophobia, it is also possible to reach out to people's logic and to people's humanity. Of course we all love our own families and our own children, and we all love our own human rights and find other people's a little bit more expensive, but we are empathetic creatures as human beings. We have emotion and reason that can both be harnessed by brave politicians and by committed campaigners to get that message across. I think the biggest challenge that we face in Britain today is the existential threat to the Human Rights Act. There are too many politicians who are now openly suggesting that Britain should ignore the European Convention on Human Rights and should scrap the Human Rights Act. And this is something that all people who care about human rights for everybody, as well as for the most vulnerable, and that is in particular refugees and migrants and children, this is something that we should all rally together around. Let's just remember that the Human Rights Act is the one means by which anyone in Britain, national or foreign national, can hold the powerful to account. It's been used to protect the privacy of people who had their telephones hacked by big news corporations. It's been used, of course, by refugees and asylum seekers, but also by victims of crime, also by members of the armed forces who were inadequately protected by the government. Ultimately, the Human Rights Act is the tool by which the vulnerable can hold the powerful to account in Britain. And ironically, the effect of scrapping it tomorrow wouldn't just mean that people had less protection in detention, on the street, in the courtroom, in the classroom and elsewhere. It would mean that human rights challenges would all have to go to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. So it's a rather Eurosceptic own goal and completely illogical to talk about scrapping the Human Rights Act, and that would effectively mean ceding more important decisions away from British courts to the court in Strasbourg. That isn't good for people's sense of sovereignty and empowerment, but it isn't good for the speed and effectiveness of protection that vulnerable people need. The values in the Human Rights Act are, when they're pared down, the values of ordinary people in Britain. It's just they're not told about it. This is really, I think, the most important message of all. Of course, if you ask people whether unworthy people are getting protection from the courts, there's a knee-jerk instinct that says yes, they are. This is what they've been fed by politicians and certain parts of the media. But if you ask them a different question and you cut through the rhetoric and get into the substance of what human rights values are, you get a very, very different message. At Liberty, we conduct regular polls of the British public to gauge their attitudes and feelings towards human rights. And we've been asking the same questions about every 6 months for a number of years. The first question we always ask is, do you think it's important that there is a law in Britain that protects everyone's fundamental rights and freedoms? And repeatedly, year on year, we get an overwhelming majority of those asked that question saying yes. It's 95+%. I think it's vital or important that there is a law that protects everyone's rights and freedoms in Britain. The second question we ask goes like this. Of the following fundamental rights and freedoms, which do you think are vital or important, useful or trivial? And we go through the various key components of the Human Rights Act. The right to life, the right not to be subject to torture or inhuman and degrading treatment, the right not to be a slave, the right to physical liberty, the right to a fair trial, the right to respect for your private and family life, freedom of thought, conscience and religion, freedom of speech and expression, freedom of association, and crucially, equal treatment under the law. We say, which of these do you think are vital or trivial? And once more, we get an overwhelming majority of people saying these rights are all vital or important. The final question is very revealing. Do you remember, we say, ever having received any public education or information from the government about the Human Rights Act? And usually less than 10% people say they do remember. And frankly, that's a false memory. There was never any public education about the Human Rights Act when it was brought into force in October 2000. I think that the last government had already got cold feet about passing this wonderful modern British Bill of Rights that would protect everyone. They had cold feet because, like any government, they knew that this would be a tool that would be used to hold the government itself to account. It's a sad part of history, it seems, that the powerful never give up their power or have it tempered lightly. But that doesn't mean that it isn't an equal lesson of history, that when people come together in support of perennial human values, they can make a difference, they can make a change. That's been the experience of my lifetime. I never thought I'd see the fall of apartheid in South Africa or the Berlin Wall and so many other wonderful progressive developments. And equally, in my professional life, I never thought that a small NGO like Liberty would be able to reach out to people across the political spectrum and make common cause with all sorts of people in politics, the media and the law to defeat the last government's proposal to lock suspects up for 42 days without charge or trial. They were not popular people, that group. They were terror suspects, and yet with our values and our reasoned arguments, we were able to make a change. I think we can do that in relation to saving the Human Rights Act, but it is a big challenge and we need all the help we can get. We need people's experiences, we need their experiences that come from around the world and living in places where human rights are not protected. We need to say to people in Britain, you care about human rights over there, you've got to show the lead over here. That's what my counterparts, my brave, much braver, much better colleagues who run human rights organisations around the world say. They say, your diplomats from Britain are always asking how they can help in our struggle in Egypt or Burma or Pakistan or whichever country it is. They're always asking how they can help, and we say, you help the development of universal human rights values in my country if you protect them in your country. That's the message we need to get across to ordinary people in Britain. Sometimes white noise gets in the way, politics, media politics, fear, all sorts of things can get in the way, but in my experience people are slightly better than not. If we can tell these stories simply and share these values, they will resonate with people. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to talk about the importance of saving the Human Rights Act. Please think about joining Liberty, the National Council for Civil Liberties. Go on our website and see if our campaigns appeal to you, particularly the Common Values campaign, which is about the Human Rights Act. And I wish you a wonderful rest of the day. Many thanks.